Hey, good morning. Pardon? I'll say something in a few minutes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're in 1 Corinthians 7 if you want to open your Bibles. I do have a study sheet. It is, I think this is the third lesson on this study sheet, which is really wasn't my intent when I said that I was going to try to do everything in a 2-page study sheet. It's the one that says lesson 11, but the study sheet is, I don't necessarily go by the study sheet. That's kind of like for your information. I did a little extra explanation here or there. Several of you have asked about Tina. She is back in the hospital, and this has to do with complications again. So I may share more a little later. So you can continue to pray for her, and I thank you for that. We're in 1 Corinthians 7. Paul is dealing with a situation at Corinth, and it appears that there is a group of people that have become very ascetic in their Christianity. They believe they've become so spiritual that the mundanities of life or the everyday living, the trappings of human life itself are unspiritual. And specifically, they're looking at marriage and sexual relations as being unspiritual. Somehow they have gotten in their head that this is something that spiritual people should grow beyond, even if you're married. And there could be really a whole lot more than just that going on, but that certainly is going on to some extent. Now, the Corinthians have presented this statement to Paul. This is a section of 1 Corinthians where we begin to see some questions or some views that they are presenting to Paul. And the Corinthians come, and he says in verse 1 now, about the things that you wrote, it is good for a man not to marry. Now, that's not what the text says. Literally, as we mentioned in the King James Version, it says it is good for a man not to touch a woman, and the actual, what would you say, idiomatic usage of that would be, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Now, Paul isn't saying that, I believe. There are other people that do believe that's what Paul is saying. But in most modern translations today, you will see that those words are in quotation marks, meaning this is something the Corinthians are asking him about. And so Paul begins to answer this one by one. I'm just going to read, and then I will pause, and I will say what we have spoken of before, and then I will continue. Now, for the matters you wrote me about, it is good for a man not to marry. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Now, while Paul isn't saying that it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, Paul himself has the spiritual gift of celibacy. And Paul himself believes that singleness is a better way of serving the Lord. That is his opinion. And in this text, what you will see is Paul describing some things that come directly from the Lord. And some things he will describe are his own opinion. Now, Paul does a pretty good job of explaining that to us. He'll say something like, well, this is not the Lord saying this, I say it by concession. Or he will say, it is good for the present time. Or, I wish everyone was like me. But he's not making a command from the Lord as much as he is giving what we would call maybe inspired advice. So we believe it is inspired in the sense that God has sent it to us, he has protected it, so that what is said, was meant to be said, and it's been properly passed down. But at the same time, some of these things are commands, and some of these things are Paul saying, okay, I say this by concession, this is my opinion. Whenever you talk about it is good, he's not saying it is sinful if you don't do it. He just says maybe it's best for now that you do this. Now, if anyone have a question about that? Does that bother anyone if I said it incorrectly? Now, most of the places in the Scripture you don't find people giving opinions, but Paul seems to clearly state that some of this is his opinion in this particular chapter. All right, he says, in answer to what you're saying, it's good for a person not to have sexual relations, he says, but because of immorality. This is a concession that we understand. He says every man should have his own wife and every woman should have her own husband, because immorality is something that was prevalent, especially there in Corinth. That is something that we need to understand. He says the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. This presupposes a situation where you have a married couple. Perhaps one thinks that they have become too spiritual to have to do something as degrading as sexual relations. That's kind of the idea that they have, an unspiritual kind of thing. It might have been both couples, but you can immediately see how that would be a problem within marriage, right? That if one or both decided that it would really open things up to all kinds of immorality. Some people even believe the reason that the previous chapter had to do with prostitution and not going to a prostitute was that some of the men were actually doing that because their wives were the ones that had this super spiritual attitude. Now, I don't know if I've said this yet in our study, but I think it's good. It's important for us to understand that God has made us as embodied beings. You know what that means? We have a body. We are not a soul that is now trapped in a body, but we are a body that has a soul. God is not up there dispensing souls as babies are born. As people come into existence, there is an eternality about them. There is something about us that is going to live forever. And we call it the soul, we call it the spirit. There may be many ways that we can describe it, but it's that part of us that's going to live forever. But He made us as embodied beings. The soul was never intended to live outside the body, even though that's going to happen temporarily. When we die, the soul goes to be with God, or the spirit goes to be with God, and Jesus will be bringing all of these spirits back with Him when the dead is raised, and our bodies will be raised from the dead. So that's the only time that the body, but even then, our spirits will be rejoined with our physical bodies that are raised from the dead, and they will now be spiritual bodies. That doesn't mean we are spirits floating around, but it will be a spiritual body. It will be an eternal body, something that's going to live forever. So, when God created us, what did He say? What did He pronounce over all of creation? It's good. It's very good. Whenever he created Adam and Eve, the sexual relationship, the marriage relationship, what did he say? It is very good. Therefore shall a man name husband and wife. Therefore shall a man leave mother and father and cling to his wife. And then, being two, shall become one flesh. So it's good. Yes, sir.
I might have got confused. Something you said, I didn't get the impression there was any kind of procreation in the Garden of Eden.
I don't exactly know when that happened.
Well, they got embarrassed and did the fig leaf thing.
Yeah.
And so it might have been a very innocent.
It might have been. Outside of the garden, it is specifically said that they had sexual relations. It is not specifically said inside the garden. God gave them all the trees in the garden, right? All the plants, all the fruit. And it was all good for food, right? That means it tasted good, right? That means it was good. You eat much this weekend? Did you make that banana brulee? That is fantastic. I think Tina liked the pecan pie best, but the banana brulee, that was great. I like to eat. I really do. I like to eat. And I like the taste of food. I like the texture of food. I like the smell of food. But let me tell you what, that is a gift from God. My mother is 84 years old. She has reached the point where she cannot enjoy food anymore. She can't taste it. It's all bland. It's all dull to her to do that. I once knew a woman, also advanced in years. Everything she ate was just bitter. She had lost the ability to taste sweet. And matter of fact, though, that's the only thing my mother will eat. She basically has a diet of milk and Hershey's chocolate. And that's what she loves. That's what she eats. In any event, God has blessed us with this for us to enjoy. And that's a good thing. Now, I'm going to say something that's going to shock you, okay? Sometimes I call myself a Christian hedonist. Now, you'd think those are two opposite things, right? How can you be a hedonist or a sensualist and be a Christian at the same time? Actually, the term doesn't belong to me. The term belongs to John Piper. He believes that life should be for enjoying who God is. He says that's the greatest joy of life, is to enjoy what God is. Now, I don't know if he would take it as far as I'm saying, because everything in life can lead to excess, and that's not a good thing. But I believe that in enjoying the good things that God has provided us, even in this human body, we are enjoying what God has provided. Therefore, we are enjoying God. You see what I'm saying? God did not create the body evil. He didn't create the spirit good. It's just a big mix. And everything that God created for good can be used for evil, including the body, including excesses of what we enjoy. But I think God has meant for us to enjoy the time that we have here. I think the author of Ecclesiastes kind of figured that out. He says there's just so much sorrow and pain and stuff going on in the world. You need to enjoy your wife. You need to enjoy a good meal. You need to enjoy, he said it, not me, a good drink. He says you need to enjoy life because that's what life is about. And then he says, yeah. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. But you see, it is God that gave us these things to be good. So, I believe coming from an ascetic position of saying that there are certain things that are wrong, like that, I think it's misplaced. If God gave it to us and we pursue it within the parameters that God has given us, it's good. And it's not bad, it's not demeaning, it's not unspiritual. And that includes sexual relations. But Paul, as he's talking to these folks, he says, it is also okay to be celibate. He says, it's a gift. It's a gift for me. Paul apparently had no desire whatsoever. And you know, when you consider the immorality around, it probably served him well. But he goes on to say that just think of all the things that single people can do in their service to the Lord. They can be fully dedicated to Him and not have to worry about pleasing their husband, about pleasing their wife. There are just a lot of things. Tina has helped me in many, many ways in our marriage. We've gone on Bible studies together. We've gone on mission trips together. We have been involved in small group studies. We've been involved in so many things in our ministry. But there are also things as a married couple that would not work for us. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there's a scripture. Don't men not treat their wives so the prayers aren't hindered.
That's true. That's true. Harold said there's a scripture that says men ought to treat their wives well, lest their prayers be hindered. So what Paul is saying in the scripture is that there is nothing wrong with sexual relations, but he's also saying there's nothing wrong with being celibate. There's a lot of reasons that you might choose to remain celibate, and some people have even been given that gift for that very purpose. But he says within the marriage relationship, you can't let this misplaced idea of asceticism or that sex is somehow unspiritual get in the way of this decision you've made to be a married person. And some people say, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just divorce my husband or wife, and that way I don't have to worry about that. Paul says, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. Later he's going to say Christians ought to remain in the, what is the word? Is it state they were in? Pardon? Yeah, it refers to status, but it's more than just that. Circumstance, that may be what the word says, and we'll get to it here in a minute. I'm actually spending too much time on that's one of the reasons this is the third lesson that we're in this chapter. I really didn't let's see. And he says, no, you can't do that. Don't deprive one another within marriage. And he says, here's an exception. He said, I say this by concession, unless you want to spend time in prayer and fasting. He says, but then only do that a short time so you'll come back so you won't be tempted. And he says, verse 6, he says, I say this as a concession. That's how we understand that what he's saying here is his opinion. He says, I say this by concession. I'm not commanding you. And then he says, not as a command. Do you see that? He's very explicit with it. I wish that all men were as me. That's his opinion. But each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift and one has that. Now to the unmarried and widows I say, now he's probably talking about widows and widowers here, because he's going to talk about the unmarried in another section. So the word unmarried here could be used for widows or widower. As for the widower and widowers and widows, I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I am. Now, did he say it was a command that they stay unmarried? No, he didn't. He says it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I am. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. And that's the same thing that he said up here about that. He said, I think you were wrong to pursue an ascetic lifestyle. However, there are some benefits that I see for myself. And he says, so for now, some of you, maybe it's best if you didn't remarry. He says, but I say that not by command, but by concession. To the married, I give this command, but the Lord, a wife must not separate from her husband. A husband must not divorce his wife. There's some people say, well, I know how I'll solve this problem. I'll just divorce my husband or wife. And Paul says, no, that's not the Christian way of handling that either. Verse 12, and to the rest I say this, I, not the Lord, if a brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Now what he's saying here is that the next logical step, okay, is he says, don't divorce so you can practice an ascetic lifestyle. That's not the Christian way. He goes on to say, if you're married to an unbeliever, and this would be especially the case for someone who thought they had reached this level of spirituality, that they had kind of superseded the mundanities of life. They said, well, I'll tell you what, my husband is not a believer, and he is unclean anyway, and so I'm just going to divorce him. Paul says, no, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do it to your wife. Don't do it to your husband. And he gives a reason. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife. And in that is a way of saying that he can be converted as long as you were with him. And you know, Peter gave that same advice to wives who had unbelieving husbands. He said, you don't know, but that you can win your husband without a word. So he says you shouldn't do this. You can sanctify. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they're holy. Verse 15, but if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. It was common in the first century. These Christians had not been Christians long, maybe anywhere from 1 to 5 years, depending on when they were converted. And their spouse probably did not convert with them. And so it's very important that in this particular case, he says, but if an unbelieving spouse leaves, then a believing man or woman is not bound in those circumstances. You don't have to fight to try to keep your marriage if that's the case. Okay, that is the review up to now. Any questions or thoughts?
In what sense are the children of unbelievers unclean?
Well, not in the sense that they are actually unclean because they come from belief. In other words, not in the sense that they can't be saved. It's just that if you, well, in this case, I'm thinking what he's getting to is you may not be able to convert the child if something like this happens. It could be that the unbelieving spouse will get the child, but it is in a marriage where you and your husband are Christians, then those children have a better chance of coming to know the Lord as well. That is the way I look at it. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's how I look at it.
So basically, if you lost a child in custody to an unbelieving
Quite possible. Yes, it's quite possible, depending on the outlook and the frame of mind of the situation. Yeah, it's just a difficult situation. Anytime, I mean, we know today, just modern living, how difficult it is to deal with divorce and children and custody and such as that. So it can be very, very difficult. But as far as a child being unclean in the sense that they're not acceptable to God, I deny that completely. I don't think that is the case whatsoever. Anyone else? Look at verse 17. Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man always already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. Each one should remain in the situation he was in when God called him. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who was a free man when he was called is Christ's slave. But you were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brothers, each man, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation God called him in. All right, he's going to explain why a little more specifically here. But he says, if you are married when you come to know Christ, don't seek to be unmarried. And because of what he's going to call here the present crisis or the present trouble, he says, if you are unmarried, it might be good for you to remain the way you are. This is the advice that he's giving. He says we should try to remain in whatever state we were in when God calls us. And he says, let me ask you this question. Do you think you could be a Christian in a communist country? It might be difficult. It might be a lot more difficult than we see here, but you could be a Christian, right? All right. Go ahead.
Even in a Muslim country, you can be a Christian, but you might get killed.
Yeah. You can be a Christian. And here's the thing about it. He says, looking at social status, whatever your social status is, that really doesn't matter to the Lord. Are you a free man? Are you a slave? He says that's not going to change your earthly status is not going to change your status with the Lord. You belong to Christ. You were bought with a price. Whether you are married or whether you are single, that is your social status. That is not going to matter, when it comes to Christ, because you belong to Christ. Are you a Jew that's been circumcised, or a Gentile that's uncircumcised? That doesn't matter, because when you come to Christ. So don't seek to change your status as a human being just because you become a Christian, or just because you grow as a Christian. He says, stay in whatever status you're in. There's no need to seek to change your status. And understand this all, if you take some of these things out of context, it may not make as much sense, or it may lead you down a rabbit hole. But understand when he's talking about people who say, okay, now that I've become a Christian and now that I'm super spiritual, man, all this earthly stuff, it doesn't matter to me anymore. So I'm going to divorce my husband, or I'm not going to sleep with my husband, or whatever is the case. And Paul says, stay in the status you were in when you came to know the Lord. Anyone else have comments on that? Questions? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. It is. We are made by God and we are for God in life. And who we were before don't matter. And our status in the world, whether we are a slave, whether we're a citizen of a communist country, whether we are citizen of this, the greatest country in the world, whatever that status is, we should not seek to change that status just because we become a Christian. And that's really the message that he's getting over to them.
The way I see it is that I have a job to do and the opportunity to justify the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And after I do, it's as short as it may be, I thank Him for that opportunity. Because I feel that I'm going to have to justify, like you can see, that I'm here for Him.
Mm-hmm.
For Him, not for myself.
You're right.
So I pray here in heaven with me.
Good.
With Pastor Julia.
Thank you. She says basically she sees her life as being lived for Christ. Very good. Verse 25. Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord. He's talking about unmarried people at this point. He says, I have no command from the Lord. Again, he's mentioning, this is his opinion, but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis. Anyone know what that crisis was? It could be. I'll give you the best explanation that I have heard from most scholars. I don't know. We don't know what the crisis was. We don't know. Paul had this sense, though. He believed that Jesus could come at any minute. And he believed that maybe some really bad stuff was going to come in the world just before Jesus came again. I tried to describe this in one of my classes the other day. When Jesus came into the world was careening toward the end. It was careening toward the end. But when Jesus came, he changed all that. And all of history took a right turn. And now, as we live in Christ, or as Christ is influencing the world, the end runs parallel with history. It runs parallel with life. In other words, at any moment, it could be the moment that Jesus steps back into history and he takes us out. At any moment, that could happen. And in the first century, Paul had this really strong sense that this was going to come. Now, it's only going to be, 15 years later, that Nero is going to start persecuting Christians. And we already see pockets of Christians being persecuted all over the world. That might have been what he was talking about. Yes, sir.
And the movie Translated, which depicts the Apostle Paul moving from his century to present day, the character is actually surprised that Christ hasn't come back yet.
Yes, yeah. The early church especially. And this is something we've lost because we've been jaded by 2,000 years of looking out the window and him not coming, that we think, well, maybe he's not coming. Or maybe we don't have that same sense of urgency. Now, Peter answers that question. He says some people are actually really complaining. Where is the promise of his coming? And he says, well, you need to understand with the Lord, 1,000 years is like a day is like 1,000 years. So God doesn't count time the same way we do. And he says, secondly, he says, and he is not slack with his promises. I'm quoting the King James Version again. He is not slack with his promises, as some count slackness, but he is long-suffering to us, Lord, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. So the reason, and you can actually explain it two ways. The reason God hasn't come again is because the cup of the wickedness of the wicked has not yet been filled. And second is that the righteous people that God wants to reach have not all yet been reached. Yes, sir.
What year was this that Paul was writing?
I'm thinking it was 54 to 55.
When did they start the war between the Jews and the Romans?
That was prior to AD 70.
I know that's when the 70 AD was through.
Yeah.
Going on.
Oh, the turmoil? It was a little later. It was a little later that.
Some cities, I can't remember the name of it, before they took Jerusalem. And I thought maybe it was, things were already starting to fall apart.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, it could very well be that was the case, but we don't know the exact crisis he was talking about. I think he's probably talking about just that the Lord could come at any moment, and that this is going to be a difficult time for married people. It's going to be a difficult time for families with children. And he says, just prior to the coming of the Lord. So maybe it's best if you remain like me. But remember, he's correcting the problem at Corinth, which he believes is wrong, but he actually shares some of their sentiment about remaining celibate. All right, let's continue because our time is just about gone. Verse 29. Is that where I am? No, 25. Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think it is good that you remain as you are. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. So Paul says, this is my opinion and why I'm saying many of these things by concession. What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. You see, that seems to indicate he's talking about the coming of the Lord. From now on, those who have wives should live as those who had none, and those who mourn as those that did not, those who are happy as those that were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them, for the world in its present form is passing away. Now, while Paul isn't saying in this case that the physical body or the joys of life or the blessings of marriage he's not saying it's a bad thing. He says, just understand that very soon all these things may be gone. So you need to keep that in mind when you live. If you spend all of your life working for a retirement, and then you die of a heart attack when you're 45, you see what I'm saying? Why live all your life for the things of this world? Live for Christ, live for God. He's not advocating an ascetic lifestyle, but just understand that the day is going to come, and may come in your lifetime, when you're going to see the rug pulled out from under you on a number of things. And as you know, when persecution came, it was very difficult for families when that truly came. Verse 32, I would like you to be free from concern as an unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of the world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. Now, he's not saying it's wrong for those interests to be divided. That's probably one of the reasons that I didn't choose to go into the mission field. I think the first time I went on a mission trip alone, Tina was pregnant at home. And I could not think about what I was doing for the fact that my wife was pregnant at home. You see what I'm saying? My interests were divided. Paul himself said that, remember in our text last week, when Paul said that when he got to Troas, he found an open door, but he could not pursue it because he had no peace of mind, because Titus wasn't there, and he couldn't learn about the state of the Corinthians. An unmarried woman or a virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world so she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but so that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. Now, he's not saying it's wrong to be married. He's not saying that it is super spiritual to be unmarried or celibate. He's simply saying there are benefits to both. And it does allow people to give their complete and full devotion to God as a single person. If anyone thinks he is acting improperly toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if she is getting along in years, now actually, that I don't know if that's a poor translation or if they don't really even know what that means, but the idea, if a man is dealing improperly toward the woman that he's espoused to, it probably means that they are tempted to involve themselves in immorality. That's probably what that means. And the whole idea that she is getting up in years, it's difficult to know whether that applies to the woman or to the man, but the word can be used in the sense that he can't control himself. That's kind of what they probably think that means. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So then, he who marries a virgin does right, but he who does not marry does even better. So again, he's saying this is just a matter of my advice. Finally, he says, a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. But he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, and I think I too have the Spirit of God. And again, I don't think he is laying down canon law here. I think what he's saying is this again is my opinion is best if a widow marries in the Lord, because in that culture especially, what can you imagine would be the case with unchristian husbands in that culture? She would be walking into a lot of problems, would she not, if that were the case? All right, I know I sped through this last part. Spent much too long on this chapter than I should have, but thank you for your kind attention. And we'll begin next week, beginning at chapter 8.